On this episode of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast.
And there's still people buying it digitally on Vimeo and iTunes to have in their libraries. So even though it's on Amazon for free, people are still looking for ways to purchase it. And, above and beyond all of that, there's also church licenses. And so that's a pretty decent revenue stream for a documentary that, is going to be benefited by the church and that churches can use.
Welcome to the podcast of the Ministry of Motion Pictures, where we seek to inspire Christian filmmakers, ignite a Christian film movement, and impact the new media landscape. I'm writer and director and your host, Todd Schaefer. My guest today is documentary filmmaker Stephen McCaskell. Stephen is best known for his work on the Media Gratiae films, Puritan, Luther, The Church, and a series he's made with Tim Challies called Epic, an around-the-world journey through Christian history. His work has given him the opportunity to travel all over the world, and he has recently taken a position with Ligonier Ministries as Supervising Producer. This is episode 44. Welcome, Stephen. I have long admired your work. Your films are a great service to the church. Because they not only entertain us like a great documentary should, but they bring us face to face with important figures and movements that we're so unfamiliar with today. So I am just grateful to have you here on the program.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Todd. I really appreciate it. I'm not one to normally give interviews. I'm always very hesitant because giving interviews honestly, it makes me nervous. But when you sent over the list of questions that you had for me, I was thinking, wow, these are things that are very familiar to me and things hopefully I can speak on well and in a way that would be encouraging for up-and-coming filmmakers in our world and hopefully would be edifying in some way.
Well, your commitment to helping other filmmakers is commendable. I know on your website you've posted about 7 articles that cover the process of making a documentary, which we're going to get to in the interview. But it shows your heart for raising up the next generation of filmmakers. So how did you get started in making documentaries?
I started making documentaries in a kind of roundabout way. Before I was doing film, I was a web designer, and every web project I worked on, I truly believed was a piece of art. And I tried to create it in such a way that I was really proud of it, how it looked, how it functioned, how it left the user, feeling after they had used it. And what I came to find just over, a handful of years of me being in web development was that most websites, at best, only last 2 to 3 years, and then they are replaced. So all these pieces of art that I was creating were quickly replaced with newer websites that had the code, the web code language is always changing and always evolving, and design on web is especially always progressing, and so websites being replaced is quite common, and so all of the projects I had worked on today, there's probably very few that are still standing. And so within the creative agency I was working at the time, it was called Polymath Innovations, there was a video department, and I had asked the CEO, hey, could I join one of the video shoots? And the whole idea there is I saw film as a way to create a piece that was timeless. And by timeless, I mean it's not necessarily going to last forever, but it's going to last a lot longer than 2 to 3 years on average. Growing up, I remember my mom watching It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas season. The 1950 whatever black and white version of It's a Wonderful Life, and that still replays every year. So there's a sense that film is timeless and has this can have this impact to last, a lot longer than a web project. And so that kind of interested me, and I wanted to see what it was like to be on a film set and see what it was like from beginning to end to make a video project. Growing up, my friends and I made short films quite often, normally goofy kinds of things, but we had camcorders, and we would put together a narrative and film it and edit it in iMovie at the time. And, so we had lots of fun. I never really thought, hey, I'm going to make a career out of this, though. So at Polymath, when I joined my first video shoot, I was thinking, wow, there's a lot of things that kind of lend to my skill set that I have, that God has given me. And so I started getting more involved. I first started out as a producer, and within 2 to 3 years, I grew into the role of the director of video production. So I wasn't in charge of directing necessarily, although I had a role in an assistant directing. I was more of the producer of the films and the video projects, and slowly I started doing less and less web work and more video work. And it was during this time I had been thinking, how cool would it be to do a film on Charles Spurgeon? I had a huge interest in Spurgeon. Spurgeon played a pivotal part in my own Christian life. His book, All of Grace, is still one of my favorite books today. It is just such an encouraging reminder of who God is, who Christ is, and what God has done for us in Christ, both as the justifier and the just. And so it's not a long book. I would encourage all to read All of Grace. So I started to put together the team for what became the team to make the documentary Through the Eyes of Spurgeon. Through the Eyes of Spurgeon was a Kickstarted project, and it was my way of seeing, is there even a market for this kind of thing? And so the Kickstarter goal wasn't huge by any means. I think it was just over $10,000 Canadian. By the time it was all done and we had raised a little bit more money, I think our budget was between $20,000 and $30,000. But we traveled to Europe, to England, and across the U.S. to do interviews and to film on location. And so Through the Eyes of Spurgeon was the first feature film documentary I did, and the plan all along was to release that for free on Vimeo and YouTube, and it was received really well with the help of the Spurgeon Library at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is in Kansas City. We were able to, get quite a viral reaction on Twitter and on Facebook, and it was well received, and people were encouraged by it, and people enjoyed it. And from that point, I had different people reaching out to me saying, "Hey, what's next for you? What's the next project?" And I honestly wasn't even. I was going to be happy if 1,000 people watched it. If you go on YouTube now, I think it's over 1 million views. I don't know what it's at exactly now, but there's been millions of views, and people from every country in the world that have watched it and have benefited from it. And I had people reaching out saying, "Hey, what do you want to work on next? We might be interested in helping you fund your next project."
Nice. That's really where you want to be, and it seems like that is what has defined your career. And your films often have a lot of animation, and I read somewhere that you have a background in animation.
My background in animation started out in Through the Eyes of Spurgeon. I had seen a really cool technique called camera mapping, or 3D camera mapping, I think it's called, where you take this archival image that is flat in 2D, and you create a 3D space for it in After Effects, and you're able to make what is normally a quite static. Well, it is a static and boring image that you probably could only use for a few seconds. You can draw it out and use it for 10 to 15 seconds because you are moving throughout the scene in a 3D space. And so while I'm kind of familiar with After Effects, enough to be a little dangerous, I have always leaned on those that are professional motion designers and animators. And so even for Through the Eyes of Spurgeon, we had reached out to a guy named Luke Pennings, who was a student at the time, who did all the camera mapping for Through the Eyes of Spurgeon. And when the next film came out that we were working on, which was Luther, The Life and Legacy of the German Reformer, well, this was a very different beast. We had a team of people that had seen Spurgeon and had benefited from it, and they wanted to fund the next project. And so Luther was born, and this was right before the 500-year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. So we thought this would be a great time to look at Luther's life again. It had been done before, and there had been some good docudramas and good documentaries done on Luther's life, but we thought we could do it in a way that looked at his life a little differently. We wanted to spend time even focusing on some of the more controversial aspects of his life. One of the charges that is brought up against Martin Luther is that he was anti-Semitic, and so we wanted to tackle that head on, and we did in the film. We also wanted to use animation quite heavily in the film because there's so much of his life that is hard to just go on location and tell, and it just doesn't really do it justice. And so there's just over, I think it's 10 minutes of a full animation in the film, and we had our good friends up in Vancouver, Canada, Ordinary Folk, work on all of that animation. And then all of the illustration was done by a good friend up in Vancouver, Washington. At the time, he was in Los Angeles. His name is Ramel. So with Ramel and Jorge from Ordinary Folk and a crew of animators up in at Ordinary Folk in Canada, we put together this this style for what became the animation that you see in Luther. And if you haven't seen Luther and you have Amazon Prime, it's available to watch for free on Prime. So you can go to Amazon and check it out there. Another thing that was unique to Luther was it was my first time, instead of using licensed music, actually hiring composers to write original music. This is something I had always wanted to do. And because of the success, I guess you can say, of Through the Eyes of Spurgeon, I had different people reaching out to me, and one of those people was Jorge from Ordinary Folk, the animator, and another was two others were Jared Kraft and Eric Lutz or Lutz. I'm not sure how you say his last name, but they're both composers that have worked on different feature films in Hollywood, and I quickly came to find out it's not that much more money to write original music compared to licensing it. And so I loved that idea, and that's one of my favorite things still about Luther, and is the original score. You can find that on Spotify and listen to it for free there or wherever you listen to music. But it's one thing that I've taken from Luther on to all the other projects I've worked on. I almost never license music anymore. I like to work with composers to create the atmosphere that you spend so much time focusing on the atmosphere and the feeling of how it looks. Why wouldn't you spend the amount of time with how it sounds, which complements and elevates the atmosphere that you've created? And so it's one thing I highly recommend is reaching out to different composers and working with them. And even if you're find a student that's just graduated from a music school and work with them. I think you'll be rewarded with that whole process, and then the end product is stronger.
Now, you've worked with Media Gratiae on most of your projects.
My relationship with Media Gratiae is an interesting one. Back in 2013, I think it was, I joined them on their shoot. They were shooting a feature film documentary called Logic on Fire. on the preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones. And so I joined them for, I think it was 10 days, in which I was just a grip. And this was before I had filmed Through the Eyes of Spurgeon. So I was just really there to learn, to see how it was to film a feature-length documentary on location. And 6-7 years later, and I had been working with them on and off for different projects, but 6-7 years later, I find myself with a work visa, and a work visa to work here in the States. And being Canadian, it's not easy to get. And so my wife and I decided, hey, maybe we should move down to where Media Gratiae is and just work. Because at that time I had been working remote with them. Why don't we work in closer proximity to them? And at the same time, we can attend Christ Church, New Albany, where Pastor John Snyder pastors. And I had met John on some of the shoots beforehand and had spoken to him. And so we thought, hey, this might be a neat opportunity for our family just to do this and to see how the Lord would use, a year of us being down here. So we moved here in April 2019 thinking, we're only going to be here for a year. And then 2020 rolls around and we find that COVID hits and we're still here. And Media Gratiae is going through a transition in which they ask me to be the director of Media Gratiae. And so I step in after much prayer and am the director of Media Gratiae now at the start of 2020. And I served as the director for about a year and a half. And it was during that time we did a project called The Church, and we did a few other smaller projects in-house. And it was a really great time. The team, I love every member of the team. It's a small, close team. Everyone really works well together. Everyone knows each other. Everyone has their own strengths. It's very complementary. So about a year and a half later, I was offered a position at Ligonier, and John Snyder, the pastor of the church, who featured in several of the early studies for Media Gratiae, was willing to step in and to serve as the director of Media Gratiae. So it freed me to go to Ligonier, in which I've been at Ligonier now for just a month. We are about to move the family down there, so I'm very excited about that. So my new position at Ligonier is Supervising Producer of Film. And so I'll be working on long-form documentary work, just like I have done the last decade, but also shorter-form documentary work. And so there's a wide range of projects that we already have in the works, and I'm not going to talk about them yet, but I'm very excited for all of them, and I can't wait to get them out and to show you guys.
I can't wait to see what you have cooking at Ligonier. Let me know when you have a release, and I'll post it here. Will you still have a relationship with Media Gratiae in some capacity?
My work with Media Gratiae is all done now. Media Gratiae as a ministry has focused and become a little more narrow and specific in what they do, in that they're going to primarily be doing the podcasts that they do and different teaching series. I think in the future they might do a documentary or a kind of a documentary type project again. And if that happens, most likely they will outsource some of that work to actually make that happen. But yeah, my work with Media Gratiae is all finished now.
Now, you've had the opportunity to travel quite a bit shooting your documentaries, and I know that some of the countries that you've been shooting in have not been as hospitable to you producing Christian material. Tell us a little bit about your travel.
Well, I feel like I've been very blessed to have traveled to over 50 countries, all for work. It honestly doesn't even feel real, and it doesn't even feel like work. When you love your job, it doesn't even feel like you're working. And so I've been to over 50 countries for all sorts of different projects. I've been to Cuba for a short documentary film called Bibles in Cuba, in which an organization had brought in thousands of Bibles to Cubans that didn't have a Bible, and we're capturing them receiving a Bible that they've been praying about their whole life. And so that was a neat experience. I've been to the Middle East several times to document what ISIS was doing, specifically to the Christian villages and to the Christians in the ancient Nineveh plains around Mosul. It's incredible if I look back, thinking I've been to over 50 countries and had amazing experiences, met amazing people, and captured, hopefully some stories and that no one else has really been able to capture, and hopefully it sheds a light on how the Lord is working in different parts of the world. That's really my hope, and I think everyone's hope who is a part of an international, film project, especially when it is to do with modern Christianity and where the Lord is actively at work. Because one thing I think we find it really easy just to see what we're going through or what our country is going through, and not to remember that there's almost 200 other countries out there as well, and they have different contexts and different cultures and different pressures, different societal issues that they are going through as well, and many in which that Christianity is not tolerated and is in fact hated in a much different way than we experience here in the West.
I can imagine it has a potential to be more dangerous than being a war photographer, because you become the target, and you're not just a target for militant extremists. This next question I have is a bit more cerebral. Why do you think documentaries are important for the church, such as the ones that you do that focus on church history? What place do they have in serving the church?
One of the biggest projects I've been a part of, not necessarily budget-wise, but scale-wise, is Epic. And so Epic was published through Zondervan, and with Epic, we traveled to 24 or 25 different countries telling the story of Christian history through different objects. And so that's what makes Epic unique. There's a lot of, there's not maybe lots, but there's different projects out there where you are telling parts of history through people or places. And so what makes Epic unique is that it's told through an object. And so the goal was to find different objects around the world at different parts of Christian history and see how that object ties into telling a part of, the history of the church. And there might be some, personally, I love church history. I love history just in general, but I love also church history. I think every Christian should know church history, because church history is really a family history. And as soon as you have been adopted into this family, you're responsible for knowing your family history. And so one of the most accessible and easy ways to learn your family history is by watching Epic, or there's an excellent book by Sinclair Ferguson called In the Year of Our Lord. It's a really enjoyable, practical, experiential book. It's not heavy and scholarly. It's really accessible. But in that book, every chapter is a century, and so you can see how Christianity went from Jesus' time here on earth to the apostles, and then down through the centuries up into today. It's a fascinating book, and that's kind of what we did with Epic as well. So it's a little different in that we are telling the story through objects, and there's some centuries where there's just no objects left.
Well, we all know the cliche, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. And we're seeing that being fulfilled in the Christian culture today. Your work makes church history accessible and understandable. And what I love about your work is it's not just focused on the who, what, and where, but also on the how and the why. Those are much more important questions. And through these interviews with various individuals, We get to hear how certain historical figures and events, and even their convictions, had great impact on the church leaders of today. And I say that knowing that your work probably hits a very niche market, even within our Christian culture. Me and some of my friends, we buy almost every documentary you release, but not everyone who's a Christian is like us. I say that because I suspect it's probably tough for you to turn a profit on your films.
It is definitely challenging to make a profit with, I think, with almost anything, but especially with film. There's so much time and energy and resources put into creating film, and to do it well, especially, as soon as you start talking about animation and composing and stuff like that, that when you're all said and done, you have $500,000 put into it, and it's hard to get that $500,000 back. With Luther, for example, there's so many of us, including myself. I didn't take a penny of the funds that were raised to make it. So Luther, even though it was a full-time job for me for 2 years, was a full-time job on top of all of the other projects I had going on that actually funded and paid for my bills. And there were others that worked on Luther in the same fashion. So I think if you want to see films get made and to get out there, there's going to be sacrifices along the way, and they come in one way or another. It's definitely not a lucrative business, Christian documentary filmmaking. I do think it's helpful though, and I think that the church can benefit from documentary storytelling. I focus so much on historical documentary filmmaking, but I have a friend, Brandon Kimber, who's done the American Gospel films, and those deal with modern Christian issues. And I know those have been so helpful for so many to reveal reveal what is going on in the current church context and how unbiblical it is, and then to actually dig into the Bible to see what the Bible teaches. And so the kind of work I have done tends to be more church history, which I think it's important to know church history because, well, like I said earlier, it's when you're adopted into a family, it's your responsibility to know your own family history. But beyond that, I think it can help safeguard us against potential errors in the future. And I think it also can help push us to know the Lord more and more experientially, seeing how the Lord has worked in the past and how he's worked through the simple means of grace in different people's lives, and how that can be an encouragement for us to keep running the race.
That's a very good point. How often do we read in the Bible about the importance of remembering God's works and declaring his testimonies? That's not limited to the works and testimonies that we see in the Bible. And given that we have about, 3,000 years of history under the Old Testament covenants, the New Testament covers one generation, basically less than 100 years or so. So the testimonies and works of God that we have under the New Covenant are found in church history. Not as scripture, but certainly very valuable for us. I do just want to follow up with my question because you made your film Through the Eyes of Spurgeon available free on YouTube. And I just saw that you have Luther streaming on Amazon Prime for free. And I just want to ask you, if your documentaries aren't making their money back, why are you making them available for free and not trying to recoup your money?
Maybe I miscommunicated a bit there. The documentaries that I've worked on often are passion projects, and so I'm not out there. I'm not trying to make money with them personally. That said, Luther, for example, even though I didn't take a penny on that project, and there were other people who didn't as well because they wanted to see the project get made in the same way I did, and so they were happy to put time, above and beyond their normal work on it. But the people that funded that project have made that money back and a bit more. And so, that project partly due to the timing of it with the 500-year anniversary. Some of the conferences we were able to get in on, around that, and due to its lasting nature, every Halloween is also Reformation Day, and so it's becoming. I think it's I feel like it's becoming more popular every year for Protestants to celebrate that in a fun way, also in a serious way of remembering how the Lord used the Reformation. And so often people will watch Luther again every Reformation Day, or have a viewing party at their church or small group or something like that. After a period of time, it just made sense that to put Luther on Amazon Prime. And so Amazon, if you have Amazon Prime, it's free, but there's a bit of kickback that you get every view, and so it's not making money. And you'd be surprised still how many people watch it on Amazon Prime, then want to go watch or go buy the DVD and give it to their parents or their friend who maybe doesn't have Amazon Prime or doesn't have the internet connection. And so there's still people buying it digitally on Vimeo and iTunes to have in their libraries. So even though it's on Amazon for free, people are still looking for ways to purchase it. And above and beyond all of that, there's also church licenses, and so that's a pretty decent revenue stream for a documentary that is going to be benefited by the church and that churches can use. So that's Luther. Puritan has also done well. It was a bigger investment than Luther to make Puritan, because it's also beyond it just being a feature film. It's also a huge study as well. And so Puritan has continued to do well, and I see it doing well in years to come as people learn about the Puritans and want to learn about the Puritans. I mean, there's no better overview visually than to watch, the 2-hour Puritan documentary. So it's not that Christian documentary filmmaking isn't, it's not lucrative, but it's also not impossible to break even, or even, make a bit of profit and funnel it into the next project. I just think early on, especially, you have to be okay with those sacrifices that you have to make, and not really worry about making money, because that's really not our goal anyways. We want to represent our Creator well, and our God does everything with excellence, and so we want to strive to do the same, with our projects.
Now, you crowdfunded Spurgeon. Would you consider crowdfunding a project again?
I probably would use crowdfunding again. I guess it depends on the project. We did crowdfunding on Spurgeon. We also did it on Luther. And the reason we did it on Luther was it never was the intention that the funds we got through Kickstarter for Luther would be all the funds that we needed. It was really just a proof of concept. I had done a lot of research and seen that there was already some good Luther documentaries and docudramas out there. So I was curious, do people even want another Luther film? And so the Kickstarter was more of a proof of concept for Luther, and the Luther Kickstarter was a success. So then we raised the rest of the funds from different individuals and made that happen, knowing that there was that market. So I would use Kickstarter again, potentially to fund a project that's a bit different than what I normally do. So church history documentaries. So maybe if I wanted to do a narrative short film that was fiction, or some kind of parable, modern day parable, I would probably go through Kickstarter with something like that. I think that might be a fun way to involve the community, and that's one of the best things about Kickstarter is the community around it. There's some backers from the Spurgeon project, and when you support a project on Kickstarter, you're called a backer. So there's some backers from the Spurgeon project that I still have contact with. that's one really neat thing with Kickstarter is that it's community building. You offer rewards to people that help fund your project. So I would consider using it again for sure.
You've been able to get some very significant and influential leaders in the church to be interviewed on your films. Do you find it hard to get them to be involved? I mean, how does that work?
Getting interviews, especially when you're first starting out, can be a very challenging thing because you have to go through, PR people or their assistants, and in reality, you have to first convince that person that you are worth their time, and then they ask the actual person that you want to interview if they want to do it. I've had several people say no to me. I think the key in asking for interviews is, to just be clear and upfront in the email or in the phone call or however you're reaching out, what you're doing, what the end goal of the film is, and what questions you want to ask them. Help them to be as prepared as possible. It also you don't want to ask someone you're interviewing questions that are not even related to their field. So find interviews that are if you have a question on a specific time in church history and there's a scholar who that is his area of study is that time in church history, well then go obviously ask him those questions. Don't ask him questions about a different century that he's not even studied in. So you want to be smart when it comes to asking the questions.
Yeah, pretty much like any industry, really. You got to get past the gatekeepers, and then you got to be very efficient with the use of your time. Do you compensate those who you interview for your films, or do they do it just out of goodwill?
As far as the terms of how we interview people and what we offer them, most of the time, almost all of the time, there's no compensation. We'll provide them a copy of the film when it's out. Most of the time, people are happy to be involved in a project, especially now, knowing that there will be tens of thousands of eyes on it. They want to get in front of these people as well because, they're authors and speakers and so on. There have been a few occasions in which we have offered some sort of small compensation, but that's never a motivator for any of these people. They're happy to be involved in these projects. I think it might be different if we were talking about a secular film or documentary. There's an excellent TV doc series on National Geographic called Trafficked, and they're going to all these really hard to reach places, interviewing people that never are interviewed because they're often doing illegal things. And so I'm assuming you're going to have to compensate these people or incentivize them to be interviewed. So in that case, that would obviously make sense. But in our case, rarely, if ever, is there any compensation.
What advice would you give a young documentary filmmaker who's just starting out?
Over the years, I've had several people reach out to me asking, hey, Stephen, how can I get into documentary filmmaking? What kinds of things do I need to know in this area? And so I spent some time either earlier this year or late last year putting together a guide to documentary filmmaking. And in it, I have interview release forms. I have how you build a budget. I have itinerary templates. I have literally everything that I use is available on that documentary or that guide to documentary filmmaking. And that's available on my website, stephenmccaskell.com. It's all free. And the idea is I could have sold it for money, and sure, there's a lot of value in the process and everything that I've learned and put together in one place. But honestly, I just want to see more filmmakers out there making films. I think it's kind of crazy that there's only a handful of us in this little world. I want to see more. And so, I hope that's an encouragement to up-and-coming filmmakers to hopefully learn something and improve on and do it better than I did.
Let's talk about my favorite documentary, Puritan. It is brilliant, and in my mind, the best of your work in terms of production value, of taking very difficult history and theology and making it easily digestible. And as a result, it's very impactful on a personal and spiritual level. How did Puritan come about?
The Puritan film came about, and this goes back to my relationship with Media Gratiae. And so I had worked with Media Gratiae on a few projects. They had known of my work on Luther and Discipleship Explored and some other, and Spurgeon. So Reformation Heritage Books, which is Joel Beakey and team up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, they asked Media Gratiae and said, hey, would you be willing to do the documentary, the definitive documentary on Puritans? And more than just a documentary, let's also make it a study with different lectures. And so Media Gratiae then proceeded to ask me and said, hey, Stephen, would you be willing to be the director and producer of this? And, I was over the moon. At this point, I was in Canada working on, I think I had just finished Discipleship Explored, and maybe I was about to start another project. And so it was perfect timing, and it was right up my alley. And so with Puritan, I had worked with my good friend Barry Cooper on the screenplay, and I had worked with Barry Cooper on Luther. He was the presenter for Luther, and I've worked with him several times since, and he's always written the screenplays for the documentaries I've worked on. And so I hired him, wanting him to write the screenplay for Puritan. And if you go through my guide to documentary filmmaking, as far as the process goes, I spent just a ton of time as the director reading and studying the Puritans, and I put together a very detailed outline of what I think might work for a really good narrative and story arc, and some of the questions and the themes we want to touch on. And then I got input from RHB and from the Media Gratiae team. And then I sent it to Barry, and Barry at the same time is reading, everything, and then he develops the screenplay. So that's the process of how the screenplay gets going. We got Ordinary Folk, the team from Luther, to do all the animation for Puritan. I got some of the same composers from Luther, and so really it's a lot of ways the core team of Luther brought over to Puritan, and hopefully, we're continuing to improve on the last project.
Well, I loved Luther, but there is something very special about Puritan.
Every project I ever do, at the end of it, I look at it and I think, ugh, like, is this even good anymore? You spend so much time as a creative thinking things through and thinking, hey, this might be good. Oh, no, this is garbage, or, this is okay. And so there's so many emotions that you have throughout the whole process of a project, especially over the course of 2.5 years. So at the end of it, you're just kind of ready for it to get done, but at the same time, you don't want to put anything out that's less than perfect. And you never hit that mark. And so you always are wanting to improve and hope the next project is better. And I think that's just a helpful note for creatives. I think being a creative is tough in that it's hard to feel like you're ever satisfied with what you have made. And I think that's a very normal thing. That's why having a team where you can collaborate and push one another to be better, and offload different things where it's maybe not your strength and it's someone else's strength, that is super helpful, and it's always going to make your end product better, and it's going to make you actually like your end product more. We have absurd goals and expectations for ourselves, and then when we don't hit those things, we feel disappointed. I think if anything, it just I think it pushes you to make the next project better, and you're always continuing to grow and to learn and to improve, and and Lord willing, your projects will reflect that growth.
Well, with that, I am really excited to see what your next projects are going to be with Ligonier. Stephen, thank you for taking your time and for sharing your heart and your experience. And thank you for your generosity to raising up young filmmakers.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Todd. I really appreciate it. One more thing came to mind, if you don't mind me mentioning it.
Oh, sure.
Puritan has been out for, I think it's almost 2 years now. But there is something special coming out related to it later this summer or early fall. So consider yourselves among the elite few that know this, because this is not a public announcement. There's no public announcement of this yet from the team, but we are doing a Puritan collector's edition. I've already finished it all. It is the feature film, but there's 5 hours of unedited, kind of raw interview content. I mean, it kind of sounds boring, but if you enjoyed Puritan, it's actually a really engaging 5 hours, and it's with J.I. Packer, who passed away just recently. So we have his whole interview. We have John Piper, Kevin DeYoung, John MacArthur. So a lot of great people that are interviewed, and it's an interesting thing. You have the interviewee asking the question, the interviewer asking the question, and then the interviewee responding, and so it's a different experience for the viewer. Kind of it peels back the curtain a little bit. But what I wanted to say is this Puritan Collector's Edition, there's only going to be 4,000 of them made, and it's a steel book. So if you're familiar with, if you go to Best Buy, you can see those steel book DVD or Blu-ray cases. And so there's only one company in the world that makes these steel book cases, and we got them to make 4,000 of these special, and it's special art, and it comes with an NFT. If you're wondering what an NFT is, it's crypto, blockchain related. I wrote a blog post on what an NFT is earlier this year, so that's on my site if you're curious. But keep an eye out for the Puritan Collector's Edition. I'm very excited about that. It should be out later this summer or early fall.
Well, count me in for one of those. I am looking forward to that. Stephen, we pray that your move to Florida and your adjustment to this new region and climate will be a blessing, because I know you're coming from Ontario. And we'll be keeping an eye on what you're doing at Ligonier. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. I hope this has been both inspiring and edifying. You can find Stephen McCaskell on the web at stephenmccaskill.com. We will have links to Stephen's website, his series of posts on documentary production, and his films in the show notes of this episode. Also, if you wish to support the ministry and keep these podcasts going, you'll find information about how you can do that on our website at ministryofmotionpictures.org.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.